The pilot had 18 years of experience and had never diverted a flight for a passenger, not once. But when he saw what Sarah Williams showed him on her phone, he grabbed the radio and declared an emergency. The air traffic controller asked what was wrong with the aircraft. "Nothing," Captain Mitchell replied. "Everything's wrong with what's happening on the ground." 20 minutes later, when the plane touched down and medical teams rushed aboard, the entire cabin understood why some emergencies can't wait for landing. Flight 829 departed from Chicago's terminal at exactly 6:42 p.m., 13 minutes behind schedule due to a minor technical check that turned out to be nothing more than a loose sensor wire. Captain James Mitchell had performed this same route 17 times in the past 6 months. Chicago to Seattle, 4 hours and 23 minutes of routine flying over familiar terrain. He knew every landmark below, every weather pattern that typically emerged over the Rocky Mountains, and exactly which altitude provided the smoothest ride for passengers. The Boeing 737 carried 186 passengers that Tuesday evening. Business travelers heading home after long meetings, families returning from visits with relatives, students flying back to university. The usual mix of people with their own stories, their own destinations, their own reasons for being 39,000 feet above the ground. In seat 12C, near the wing, sat Sarah Williams. She was 34 years old, worked as a librarian in a small town outside Seattle, and had never traveled much beyond state lines until this year. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a navy cardigan over a plain white shirt. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was different from any other passenger settling in for the flight home. But Sarah Williams was carrying something invisible that weighed more than all the luggage in the cargo hold combined. She had boarded quietly, stowed her single carry-on bag in the overhead compartment without assistance, and taken her window seat without making eye contact with the middle-aged businessman who occupied 12B. Her hands trembled slightly as she buckled her seatbelt, though whether from turbulence, anxiety, or something else entirely, no one could have guessed. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration as the aircraft taxied toward the runway. Sarah watched politely but didn't absorb the instructions about oxygen masks or flotation devices. Her mind was elsewhere, calculating time zones, flight duration, and the critical window that was closing with every passing minute. Captain Mitchell's voice crackled through the intercom system with the standard pre-flight announcement. "Good evening, folks. This is your captain speaking. We've got clear skies ahead and should have you in Seattle by approximately 9:15 local time. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure." As the engines roared to life and the aircraft began its acceleration down the runway, Sarah pulled out her phone. The battery showed 23% remaining. She had forgotten to charge it fully during her brief layover in Denver, and now that oversight felt like a catastrophic mistake. She powered it down to preserve what little charge remained and pressed her forehead against the cool window. The lights of Chicago fell away beneath them as Flight 829 climbed into the evening sky. In the cabin, passengers began settling into their routines. Some opened laptops, others retrieved books or magazines. The businessman in 12B immediately pulled out a thick stack of documents and began reviewing what appeared to be financial reports. The woman across the aisle put in earphones and closed her eyes. Sarah did none of these things. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, watching the ground disappear into darkness below. Every few minutes she would reach into her purse and touch her phone, making sure it was still there, then force herself to leave it alone. She needed to conserve the battery for when it mattered most. Flight attendant Rebecca Chen noticed the woman in 12C during the first beverage service, approximately 40 minutes into the flight. Most passengers were eager for drinks or snacks, chatting with travel companions or settling into movies on their personal devices. But the woman by the window sat motionless, declining both water and peanuts with a polite shake of her head. "Are you feeling all right?" Rebecca asked quietly, crouching slightly beside Sarah's seat. "You look a little pale." "I'm fine, thank you," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just tired."
Rebecca noticed the woman's hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white, but she didn't want to pry. Some passengers were nervous flyers, and the best approach was usually to give them space while remaining available if needed. As the flight continued westward, crossing from Illinois into Iowa and then Nebraska, Sarah's internal countdown continued. Every minute that passed brought them closer to Seattle, but it also brought her closer to a deadline that felt more impossible to meet with each passing mile. At 8:17 p.m. Pacific Time, while the aircraft cruised smoothly at 37,000 feet somewhere over western Colorado, Sarah finally powered on her phone. The battery showed 19%. She had received 14 text messages and 6 missed calls, all from the same number. She didn't need to check the contact name to know who had been trying to reach her. Her hand shook as she opened the most recent message, sent just 7 minutes earlier. The words on the screen hit her like physical blows. She read them twice, then a third time, hoping she had misunderstood. But the message was clear, devastating, and final. Sarah's breathing became shallow and rapid. The cabin suddenly felt too warm, too confined. She looked around wildly, taking in the faces of fellow passengers who had no idea what was happening, who were peacefully unaware that someone's world was collapsing just a few feet away from them. She stood up abruptly, startling the businessman in 12B, who glanced up from his paperwork with mild annoyance. Sarah mumbled an apology and pushed past him into the aisle, her phone clutched in her trembling hand. The walk to the front of the aircraft felt like moving through thick water. Other passengers barely looked up as she passed, absorbed in their own activities. The flight attendants were in the middle of the main meal service, efficiently distributing trays and taking drink orders. Rebecca Chen was helping an elderly passenger open a difficult juice container when she noticed the woman from 12C approaching the galley area. Something about her expression immediately caught Rebecca's attention. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Rebecca set down the juice container and moved toward Sarah. "You look a little pale." "I'm fine, thank you." She started, then stopped, unsure how to explain what she needed. "I need to speak to the captain." Rebecca's training kicked in. Immediately, passenger requests to speak with the captain were unusual and potentially serious. "What's the nature of your concern? Is there a safety issue with the aircraft?" No, nothing like that. It's personal. It's urgent. Please, I know this sounds crazy, but I need 5 minutes with him." Other passengers in nearby seats were beginning to notice the conversation. Rebecca made a quick decision and gently guided Sarah into the forward galley area, partially shielded from view. "I'm going to need you to explain what's happening. I can't disturb the captain unless there is a genuine emergency."
Sarah looked down at her phone, at the message that had shattered everything she thought she knew about how this day would end. Then she looked back up at Rebecca, and the flight attendant saw something in her eyes that made her reconsider her initial assessment. "My husband," Sarah whispered. "He's dying, right now, and I'm not there." The words hung in the air between them. Rebecca had been a flight attendant for 8 years and had encountered medical emergencies, anxious passengers, and family crises before. But something about the quiet desperation in this woman's voice was different. "I'm so sorry," Rebecca said gently. "That's terrible news, but I'm not sure what the captain can do. We're already en route to Seattle, and we're making good time." "We won't make good time enough," Sarah said, holding up her phone. "This message is from his doctor. They don't think he'll survive the night. I've been away for 5 days, taking care of my mother after her surgery. I was supposed to fly back yesterday, but her condition got worse and I had to stay. Now I'm going to miss the last chance to say goodbye to my husband because I chose to stay with her." Rebecca felt her professional composure wavering. This wasn't about flight schedules or airline policies. This was about human life, about love, about the kinds of impossible choices that define our most crucial moments. "Does he know you're trying to get back?" Rebecca asked. "He's unconscious. Has been for 2 hours. The doctors said to hurry if I wanted to see him one last time. My flight was delayed in Denver, then delayed again here.
Every minute we're in the air is another minute I can't get to him." Rebecca looked toward the cockpit door, then back at Sarah. "I need to ask you something, and please understand why I have to ask. Is there anything you're not telling me? Any reason why speaking to the captain might compromise flight safety?" "No," Sarah said immediately. "I'm not dangerous. I'm not making threats. I just want to ask if there's any way to get to Seattle faster, or if there's an airport closer to the hospital where we could land instead. I know it's not how these things work, but I have to try." Rebecca made her decision. "Wait here," she told Sarah. "Don't move from this spot." She walked to the cockpit door and entered the security code. Captain Mitchell was reviewing weather reports for their approach into Seattle when she entered. "Captain, I have a passenger who needs to speak with you. It's not a safety issue, but it's urgent." Captain James Mitchell had encountered nearly every type of passenger situation imaginable in his 18-year career: drunk travelers, medical emergencies, mechanical fears, and occasional mentally unstable individuals who required careful handling. He had never once diverted a flight for personal reasons, and his initial instinct was to decline the meeting. "What kind of urgent?" he asked. "Family emergency. Her husband is dying, and she might not make it in time with our current schedule." Captain Mitchell set down his weather report and looked at Rebecca carefully. She was one of his most experienced crew members, someone who didn't dramatize situations or make unreasonable requests. "Bring her up," he said. When Sarah Williams stepped into the cockpit, Captain Mitchell's first impression was of someone holding herself together through sheer will. She wasn't hysterical or demanding. She was simply desperate, in the quiet, determined way of people who had already accepted the worst, but still needed to try everything possible.
"I'm sorry to disturb you," she began. "I know this isn't normal procedure." "Tell me what's happening," Captain Mitchell said directly. Sarah explained the situation clearly and concisely. Her husband's sudden deterioration, the doctor's prognosis, the missed connections and delays that had consumed the precious hours she needed. When she finished, she handed him her phone. Captain Mitchell read the doctor's message. It was clinical and professional, but the urgency was unmistakable. The patient's condition was critical and declining rapidly. Family members were advised to arrive as soon as possible. "Where's the hospital?" Captain Mitchell asked. "Tacoma General, about 30 minutes south of Seattle, if there's no traffic." Captain Mitchell checked his flight computer. They were currently over eastern Utah, with approximately 90 minutes remaining to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Factor in approach, landing, taxiing, and ground transport, and Sarah would reach the hospital sometime after 11 p.m. Pacific time. He looked at the message again, noting the timestamp. It had been sent at 8:10 p.m. Pacific time, which was 17 minutes ago. The doctor's estimate of hours rather than days suddenly felt much more immediate. "Ma'am, I need to ask you something important," Captain Mitchell said. "If I were able to get you to Seattle faster, or to a different airport that might save time, would you have ground transportation waiting?" "Yes," Sarah replied immediately. "My sister lives in Tacoma. She's already at the hospital. She can pick me up anywhere within an hour's drive." Captain Mitchell turned to his co-pilot, First Officer David Park, who had been listening quietly to the conversation. "Dave, pull up alternate airports within 50 miles of Tacoma General Hospital." First Officer Park's hands moved quickly over his console, accessing navigation databases and airport information. Within minutes, he had identified 3 possible options. Boeing Field is closest to the hospital, about 15 minutes by car, but it's primarily for private aircraft and cargo operations. They have the runway length for us, but getting passenger services and ground transportation might be complicated. "What about Olympia Regional?" Captain Mitchell asked. "Longer runway, full passenger services, but 30 minutes from the hospital, maybe 45 in evening traffic." Captain Mitchell studied the options, while Sarah waited, afraid to breathe, afraid to hope. She could see the two pilots conducting calculations, checking weather reports, and reviewing approach procedures for airports that weren't on their original flight plan. "Ma'am," Captain Mitchell said finally, turning back to Sarah, "I want you to understand something. If I divert this flight, it affects 185 other passengers. People will miss connections, appointments, family gatherings. The airline will face significant costs and scheduling complications. I can only make this decision if I genuinely believe it's the right thing to do." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. "I also need you to understand that even if I divert to Boeing Field, I cannot guarantee it will make the difference. Traffic, ground delays, hospital logistics, there are variables beyond my control." "I understand," Sarah managed to say. Captain Mitchell looked at her for a long moment, then at the message on her phone, then at his flight instruments showing their position over the American West. "Dave, contact Seattle Approach and request immediate clearance to Boeing Field. Tell them we have a passenger medical emergency requiring the closest possible airport to Tacoma General Hospital." Sarah's knees nearly buckled with relief. First Officer Park was already reaching for his radio microphone when Captain Mitchell held up a hand. "One more thing," the captain said to Sarah. "I'm going to need you to return to your seat and stay calm. I'm also going to need you to help me explain to the other passengers why we're changing course. Some of them are going to be upset about the disruption. Are you prepared for that?"
"Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." As Sarah left the cockpit, Captain Mitchell activated the passenger address system.
"Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're going to be making a slight change to our flight plan this evening. Instead of landing at Seattle-Tacoma International, we'll be diverting to Boeing Field, which is actually closer to downtown Seattle and South Puget Sound destinations. This change is being made to accommodate a passenger medical emergency, and I appreciate your patience and understanding." The announcement rippled through the cabin like a stone dropped in still water. Passengers looked up from their books, paused their conversations, and began reaching for their phones to check connecting flight schedules. In seat 12C, Sarah Williams closed her eyes and whispered a prayer she hadn't spoken since childhood.
The reaction in the cabin was immediate and divided. Some passengers nodded with understanding, appreciating that someone's medical emergency was being prioritized. Others immediately began calculating the impact on their own schedules, reaching for phones to contact family members or check connecting flights. In seat 8A, Margaret Foster, a retired teacher traveling to visit her daughter in Seattle, turned to her husband with a gentle smile. "That poor person," she whispered. "I hope they make it in time for whatever they're facing." 3 rows behind her, businessman Richard Chen had a very different reaction. He was scheduled for an early morning meeting with potential investors, and his entire presentation was built around arriving in Seattle with time to prepare. Boeing Field was unfamiliar territory, and he wasn't sure how ground transportation would work from a facility primarily designed for cargo operations. "This is exactly the kind of disruption that costs deals," he muttered to himself, already typing a message to his assistant about potential backup plans. Flight attendant Rebecca Chen moved through the cabin, addressing passenger concerns with practiced diplomacy. Most people were understanding once she explained that the diversion would actually save time for anyone traveling to South Seattle or Tacoma destinations. A few passengers were frustrated, but none were openly hostile. The one person who seemed most affected by the announcement wasn't complaining. Sarah Williams sat in 12C, her phone now showing 11% battery, watching the minutes tick by with excruciating awareness of how precious each one had become. She had managed to send a single text message to her sister. "Flight diverted to Boeing Field. Pick me up there. Is he still—" But she couldn't bring herself to complete the question, and her sister hadn't responded yet. As the aircraft began its descent toward the Seattle metropolitan area, Captain Mitchell worked closely with air traffic control to expedite their approach. Boeing Field's runway was shorter than Seattle-Tacoma International's, but well within the capabilities of their aircraft. The bigger challenge was coordinating ground services for passengers who would need transportation to their final destinations. Boeing Field Ground Control, this is American 829, requesting priority landing clearance and passenger ground transportation assistance. American 829, you're cleared for direct approach runway 14R. Be advised, passenger terminal facilities are limited. We're arranging shuttle service to Seattle-Tacoma International for connecting passengers.
In the cabin, passengers could see the lights of Seattle approaching through the windows. The Puget Sound stretched out below them, dotted with islands and crossed by bridges that sparkled in the darkness. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a beautiful sight. Sarah pressed her face against the window, trying to spot landmarks that might tell her exactly where they were in relation to the hospital. Her sister had texted back, "On my way to Boeing Field. Hurry." The brevity of the message was ominous. In their family, Lisa had always been the one to provide details, to explain situations thoroughly. One-word responses usually meant she was too emotional or too busy to elaborate. Flight attendant Rebecca stopped by Sarah's row during the final descent. "The captain wanted me to let you know that we're making an exceptionally fast approach," she said quietly. "We should be on the ground in less than 10 minutes. "Thank you," Sarah managed. "And thank you for listening when I needed help." "I hope everything works out," Rebecca replied, and her sincerity was evident. As the aircraft touched down at Boeing Field, passengers could see that this was indeed a very different kind of airport from the major commercial hub they had originally planned to reach. The terminal was smaller, more industrial, designed primarily for cargo operations and private aircraft. Captain Mitchell's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at Boeing Field. For passengers with connecting flights, shuttle service to Seattle-Tacoma International will be provided at no charge. For those whose final destination is in the South Puget Sound area, you may find this location more convenient than our original airport. Thank you for your patience and understanding during this diversion." The aircraft came to a stop at a gate that had been hastily prepared for passenger operations. Ground crews were already positioning a jet bridge, while airport personnel worked to organize transportation logistics for the unexpected arrival. Sarah was one of the first passengers to stand when the seatbelt sign was turned off. Her hands shook as she retrieved her carry-on bag, and the businessman in 12B, who had been mildly irritated by her earlier movement through the cabin, now looked at her with something approaching concern. "Are you all right, miss? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Family emergency," Sarah replied simply, not trusting herself to say more.
"I hope everything turns out okay," he said, and his tone suggested he genuinely meant it. As passengers began filing off the aircraft, Sarah found herself caught in the normal pace of deplaning, desperately wanting to push ahead, but constrained by the orderly process of people retrieving belongings and moving through the narrow aisle. Rebecca appeared beside her. "The captain asked me to make sure you get off first," she said, gently guiding Sarah toward the front of the line. "He's arranged for airport personnel to help with your ground transportation." Other passengers stepped aside without complaint when they understood the situation. Margaret Foster, the retired teacher, reached out to briefly touch Sarah's arm as she passed. "Whatever you're facing, dear, you're not facing it alone," she said softly. Sarah nodded, unable to speak, and continued toward the aircraft door. Captain Mitchell was waiting in the jet bridge as she exited the plane. "Ma'am," he said, "there's a woman in the terminal who says she's your sister. Airport security has confirmed her identification, and she's waiting for you just past the gate." "Captain Mitchell," Sarah began, tears finally coming. "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks needed," he replied. "I hope you make it in time." Sarah hurried through the gate area and immediately spotted her sister Lisa standing near a window, still wearing scrubs from her job as a surgical nurse. Lisa's face was puffy from crying, but she managed to smile when she saw Sarah approaching. The sisters embraced without words, holding each other in the way that only family members can when crisis strips away everything except love and fear.
"How is he?" Sarah whispered. He's still with us, Lisa replied. But Sarah, we need to hurry. The doctor said hours, not days, and that was 3 hours ago. They hurried through the small terminal toward the parking area. Lisa's car was parked in a loading zone with hazard lights flashing, and she had clearly explained the emergency to airport security, who had allowed her to wait there. As they drove through the late evening Seattle traffic toward Tacoma General Hospital, Lisa filled Sarah in on the details that text messages couldn't convey. He collapsed at work around 2 p.m., massive heart attack. They got him to the hospital quickly, but there was significant damage. He had surgery to place stents, but his heart is so weak that they're not sure he'll survive the night. Is he conscious? He was earlier. He kept asking for you. He wanted to know if you were coming back from Mom's, and when I told him you were flying home tonight, he seemed to relax a little. Does he know about the flight change? I haven't been able to reach him since they sedated him for another procedure around 7 p.m. Sarah, I need to prepare you. He looks very different from when you left for Mom's. The machines, the tubes, it's overwhelming. Sarah nodded, staring out the window at the lights of Tacoma approaching in the distance. 5 days ago, when she had kissed her husband goodbye at the airport before flying to help her mother, everything had been normal. David had been healthy, complaining only about a busy week at the accounting firm where he worked. There had been no warning signs, no indication that their goodbye kiss might be their last. I should have come back sooner, Sarah said. Mom was doing better yesterday. I could have caught an earlier flight.
Don't do that to yourself, Lisa replied firmly. You couldn't have known. And Mom needed you too. You can't be in 2 places at once. They pulled into the hospital parking garage at 10:47 p.m. Sarah's phone was now at 4% battery, but it no longer mattered. She was here. She was close. And for the first time in hours, she allowed herself to believe that she might make it in time. The elevator ride to the cardiac intensive care unit felt endless. Lisa held Sarah's hand as they rose through the floors of the hospital, past the emergency department where David had first arrived, past the surgical suites where doctors had worked to save his life, toward the unit where he was fighting to stay alive long enough to see his wife one more time. The CICU was quieter than Sarah had expected. Nurses moved efficiently between rooms, checking monitors and adjusting medications, but there was a sense of controlled calm rather than emergency chaos. Lisa approached the nurses' station and spoke quietly with a woman who checked a chart and nodded. Room 417, the nurse said to Sarah. He's been asking for you. Sarah's heart jumped. He's awake? He drifts in and out. The sedation was lighter than we initially planned because he kept trying to stay conscious. Dr. Rahman is with him now. They walked down the hallway past rooms where other families were maintaining vigils beside loved ones connected to machines that measured heartbeats and breathing patterns. Sarah realized that her crisis was just one among many playing out simultaneously in this building. Outside room 417, Dr. Rahman emerged, a kind-faced cardiologist who immediately recognized Sarah from Lisa's descriptions. "Mrs. Williams," he said gently, "your husband has been waiting for you. I want to be honest about his condition. His heart is functioning at less than 20% capacity. We're doing everything possible to keep him stable, but the damage from the heart attack was extensive." "Can I see him?" "Of course. Just know that he may not be responsive at first. The medications we're using to support his heart function can affect consciousness. But he knows you're here. I believe that's what's been keeping us with him." Sarah entered the room and immediately understood what Lisa had meant about the machines. Her husband of 12 years was connected to monitors that beeped and hummed, displaying numbers and waveforms that translated into the basic functions of staying alive. His face was pale and drawn, but his breathing was steady.
"Sarah," he whispered, his voice weak but unmistakably filled with relief. "I'm here," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm here, David. I'm so sorry I wasn't here sooner." "You're here now," he replied, squeezing her hand with what little strength he could muster. "That's what matters."
Behind them, in Boeing Field's small terminal, the remaining passengers from Flight 829 were boarding shuttle buses to complete their journey to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Some grumbled about the inconvenience, others spoke admiringly about their captain's decision to divert for a fellow passenger's emergency. Margaret Foster, the retired teacher, turned to her husband as their shuttle pulled away from Boeing Field. "I wonder if that young woman made it to wherever she needed to go," she said. "I hope so," he replied. "It takes courage to ask for help like that." In the cockpit of the now empty aircraft, Captain Mitchell was completing his post-flight paperwork. The diversion would require additional reports and explanations, but he felt no regret about the decision. First Officer Park was securing the aircraft systems and preparing for the overnight maintenance check. "Think we did the right thing, Captain?" Park asked. "Ask me that question again if you ever find yourself in a hospital bed, hoping someone you love can get to you in time," Mitchell replied. The two pilots gathered their flight bags and headed for the crew transportation that would take them to their hotel. In 18 years of flying, Captain Mitchell had transported thousands of passengers safely to their destinations. Tonight was the first time he had knowingly risked criticism and complications to ensure that one passenger reached the most important destination of her life. As they walked through the quiet Boeing Field terminal, they passed a coffee shop where a few passengers were waiting for later shuttle departures. The conversation they overheard was entirely about the woman who had needed to reach someone urgently and whether she had made it in time. "I hope so," someone was saying. "You could see it in her face how important it was." Captain Mitchell smiled to himself and continued toward the exit. He would never know the end of Sarah Williams' story, but he had played his part in giving her the chance she needed. Back in room 417 at Tacoma General Hospital, Sarah sat beside her husband's bed, holding his hand and telling him about her mother's recovery, about the flight that had been diverted to bring her to him, about the kindness of strangers who had helped make it possible. David listened with his eyes closed, occasionally squeezing her hand to let him know he was following her words. The monitors continued their quiet symphony of beeps and hums, measuring the precious time they had been given together.
The hours that followed were unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Time seemed to move differently in the cardiac intensive care unit, measured not by clocks, but by the steady rhythm of heart monitors and the gentle squeeze of David's hand in hers. Dr. Rahman had explained that the next 12 hours would be critical. David's heart was working, but barely, supported by medications that couldn't be used indefinitely. His body needed to find strength from somewhere deeper than medical intervention could reach. "Talk to him," Dr. Rahman had advised. "Even when he seems unconscious, he can hear you. Sometimes that connection is more powerful than any medicine we have." So Sarah talked. She told David about their neighbor's new garden, about the book she had been reading on the flight, about how their cat had knocked over a plant while she was away, and how she had found soil scattered across the kitchen floor when she returned from helping her mother. She told him about small things, ordinary things, the fabric of their life together that suddenly felt precious beyond measure. "Remember when we first moved into the house?" she whispered, stroking his hand. "You spent 3 weekends trying to fix that leaky faucet in the bathroom. You were so determined to do it yourself, even though neither of us knew anything about plumbing." David's eyes fluttered open, and she saw the ghost of a smile cross his lips. "Finally had to call a professional," he managed to say, his voice barely audible above the machines. "And it cost twice as much because you had made it worse," Sarah continued, laughing through her tears. "But you were so proud when it finally worked." "Still proud," David whispered. "Made our home together."
Lisa appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the hospital's 24-hour cafeteria. She had changed out of her scrubs and into jeans and a sweater, settling in for what everyone understood would be a long night. "How's he doing?" Lisa asks quietly. "He's fighting," Sarah replied. "He's been awake on and off for the past hour." Lisa nodded and took a seat in the corner chair, giving her sister and brother-in-law space, while remaining close enough to help if needed. As a surgical nurse, she understood the rhythms of hospital vigils, the way families gathered around loved ones during critical hours. Around 2 a.m., David's condition began to deteriorate. The numbers on his monitors started shifting in directions that brought nurses hurrying into the room. Dr. Rahman was called, and after examining David and reviewing his charts, he asked to speak with Sarah privately in the hallway. "His heart is weakening," Dr. Rahman explained gently. "We've increased the medication dosages as much as we safely can. At this point, we're essentially buying time, hoping his heart can recover enough function to sustain him without this level of support." "What are the odds?" Sarah asked, though part of her didn't want to know. "I've seen patients recover from worse conditions," Dr. Rahman replied carefully. "I've also seen patients with better prognoses who didn't make it through the night. Every case is different. What I can tell you is that he's defied my expectations by staying stable this long. The human heart sometimes finds strength we can't measure or predict." Sarah returned to David's bedside, where he was sleeping fitfully. The medications were making him drowsy, but every few minutes he would stir and look for her, relaxing only when he confirmed she was still there. "I'm not going anywhere," she told him each time. "I'm right here." At 4:17 a.m., David's eyes opened with unusual clarity. He looked at Sarah with the same expression she remembered from their wedding day, 12 years earlier, when he had seen her walking down the aisle toward him. "Sarah," he said, his voice stronger than it had been all night. "I'm here. I need you to know something." She leaned closer, afraid to miss any words. "These past 12 years, they were the best years of my life. Every single day with you was a gift."
David, don't talk like that. You're going to have many more years. "Maybe," he said, "but if I don't, I want you to know that I never felt cheated or shortchanged. We had a good life together." Sarah was crying now, but she tried to keep her voice steady. "We're going to have many more good years together. You just need to keep fighting." "I am fighting," David assured her, "but I'm fighting for the right reasons now. Not because I'm afraid to die, but because I want to live. There is a difference." Around 5 a.m., something remarkable began to happen. David's heart rhythm started to strengthen and stabilize. The numbers on his monitors began moving in positive directions for the first time since Sarah had arrived at the hospital. Dr. Rahman appeared for his early morning rounds and studied the monitors with barely concealed surprise. "This is encouraging," he said to Sarah. "His heart function has improved significantly over the past hour. We're not out of the woods yet, but this is the first genuinely positive development we've seen." "What does it mean?" "It means his heart is responding to treatment better than we had hoped. We'll need to monitor him closely for the next 24 hours. But if this trend continues, we may be able to reduce the medication support and see if his heart can maintain this function on its own." As the sun began to rise over Tacoma, painting the hospital room in soft morning light, Sarah felt hope returning for the first time since receiving that devastating text message on the airplane. David was sleeping peacefully now, his breathing steady and his color improved. The crisis wasn't over, but the immediate danger seemed to be passing. Lisa brought fresh coffee and a bagel from the cafeteria, insisting that Sarah needed to eat something. "You haven't had anything since yesterday," Lisa pointed out. David's going to need you to be strong for whatever comes next." As Sarah ate, she found herself thinking about the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. If her flight hadn't been delayed in Denver, she would have arrived in Seattle on schedule and driven to Tacoma, probably reaching the hospital around the same time. But the delays had created a crisis that revealed something she might never have discovered otherwise. Captain Mitchell's decision to divert the flight didn't just save time. It had demonstrated that when human life and love are at stake, ordinary procedures and policies can be set aside in favor of something more important. She thought about the passengers who had been inconvenienced by the diversion, and whether any of them were still upset about the change in their travel plans. She hoped they would understand, if they ever learned the full story, why the decision had been necessary. Around 8 a.m., Dr. Rahman returned with news that seemed almost miraculous. "We're going to try reducing the medication support," he announced. "David's heart function has continued to improve through the night, and we want to see if he can maintain this progress with less artificial assistance." Over the next several hours, David's medical team gradually decreased the dosages of the drugs that had been supporting his heart function. Each reduction was monitored carefully, with everyone prepared to increase support again if his condition deteriorated. But his heart continued to function steadily on its own. By noon, David was awake and alert enough to have a real conversation. His voice was still weak, but his thinking was clear, and his color had returned to something approaching normal. "Tell me about the flight," he asked Sarah. "Lisa said something about a pilot changing course?" Sarah told him the entire story, from the moment she received Dr. Rahman's text message on the airplane, to her desperate conversation with Captain Mitchell, to the diversion that had brought her to Boeing Field instead of Seattle-Tacoma International.
"I want to write him a letter," David said when she finished. "That man probably saved my life by getting you here when he did." "I don't even know his full name," Sarah realized. "Just Captain Mitchell." "The airline will have his information," Lisa suggested. "I'm sure they'd forward a letter to him." Dr. Rockman appeared for his afternoon rounds with the best news yet. "We're going to move you out of intensive care," he told David. "Your heart function has stabilized at a level where you no longer need this intensity of monitoring." The transfer to a regular cardiac unit room felt like a celebration. David was still connected to monitors and would need several more days in the hospital, but the immediate crisis had passed. As they settled into the new room, Sarah finally allowed herself to believe that they were going to get through this together. "I keep thinking about something," David said as evening approached. "When you were on that plane, asking the captain to change course, you didn't know if I would still be alive when you got here. I tried not to think about that possibility. But you did it anyway. You fought for every minute, every chance to see me again, even though you couldn't know if it would make a difference." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "That's love," David said simply. "Real love doesn't calculate odds or guarantee outcomes. It just fights for what matters most." Meanwhile, at Boeing Field, Captain Mitchell was beginning his next scheduled flight, a routine morning departure to Denver. As he completed his pre-flight checks, First Officer Park mentioned something he had heard from ground crew. "They said that passenger from last night, the woman with the family emergency, her husband is going to make it. Someone from the hospital called to let the airport know since we had diverted for her." Captain Mitchell felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the morning coffee he was drinking. In 18 years of flying, he had transported thousands of passengers safely to their destinations. But this was the first time he had received confirmation that a single flight decision had helped save a life. "Good," he said simply. "That's good news." As their aircraft lifted off from Boeing Field and climbed into the morning sky, Captain Mitchell reflected on the events of the previous evening. He had made a decision that violated standard procedures and created complications for nearly 200 people, but he felt no regret. Sometimes, the most important destinations aren't on flight plans or airport schedules. Sometimes they exist in hospital rooms, in moments of crisis, in the spaces where love and time intersect in ways that can't be measured by airline timetables. 3 weeks later, Sarah Williams sat at her kitchen table, writing a letter on paper she had bought specifically for this purpose. David was home from the hospital, recovering well, and scheduled to return to work on reduced hours in another 2 weeks. The letter was addressed to Captain James Mitchell, care of the airline's Seattle Operations Center, and it began with 2 simple words: "Thank you."
She wrote about the text message that had shattered her world while sitting in seat 12C, about the desperate conversation in the aircraft galley, about the captain's willingness to divert an entire flight for a stranger's emergency. She wrote about arriving at the hospital in time to hold her husband's hand through the worst night of their lives, about the recovery that doctors had called remarkable, about the second chance they had been given together. She wrote about the ordinary moments that had become precious. David reading the newspaper at breakfast, the sound of his key in the front door when he came home from cardiac rehabilitation sessions, the way he still reached for her hand when they walked together. At the end of the letter, she wrote, "I will never know all the reasons why you decided to help me that night, but I want you to know that your decision gave us back our life together. We will never forget that kindness." She sealed the letter and drove to the post office, where she sent it with the same care she might have used for the most important correspondence of her life, because it was. Captain Mitchell received the letter 4 days later, reading it in the crew lounge during a layover in Phoenix. When he finished, he folded it carefully and placed it in his flight bag, where he would carry it for years to come. He never responded to the letter, not because he didn't appreciate it, but because he understood that some acts of kindness are complete in themselves. The gratitude had been received and acknowledged. The circle was closed. But he kept the letter, and sometimes during long flights over familiar terrain, he would remember the evening when routine procedures had been set aside for something more important than schedules or regulations. He would remember that aviation, at its best, isn't just about moving people efficiently from one place to another. Sometimes it's about making sure they reach the destinations that matter most, even when those destinations weren't part of the original flight plan. 6 months later, Sarah and David Williams were sitting in their backyard on a warm Saturday afternoon, watching their neighbor work in the garden that Sarah had described to David during those critical hours in the hospital. David's recovery had exceeded everyone's expectations. His heart function had returned to nearly normal levels, and while he would need to take medications for the rest of his life, his cardiologist was optimistic about his long-term prognosis.
"Do you ever think about that night?" David asked, reaching for Sarah's hand. "Every day," she replied. "Not the scary parts anymore, but the good parts. The people who helped when I needed help. The pilot, the flight attendant, your sister, the doctors and nurses, even the passengers who stepped aside to let me off the plane first. It was like the whole world conspired to give us this chance." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to birds in the trees and the distant sound of children playing in a nearby yard. These were the moments that had seemed so fragile during that night in the hospital, but which now felt solid and permanent again. "I love you," David said, words he had spoken thousands of times before, but which carried extra weight now. "I love you too, David," Sarah replied, squeezing his hand. "I love you too." Above them, a commercial airliner traced a line across the clear sky, carrying its own load of passengers toward their own destinations, their own appointments with whatever waited for them on the ground. Captain Mitchell happened to be piloting that particular flight, though neither Sarah nor David knew it. As he guided the aircraft along its prescribed route, he glanced down at the neighborhoods below and wondered, as he often did, about the lives being lived in those small houses and apartments. He thought about the passengers in the cabin behind him, each carrying their own hopes and fears and urgent needs, and he felt the familiar satisfaction of knowing he was helping them reach where they needed to go. It was just another routine flight, following standard procedures, arriving on schedule. But Captain Mitchell understood now, in a way he hadn't fully grasped before that night at Boeing Field, that every flight carried the potential for something extraordinary. Every passenger had destinations that weren't listed on boarding passes, people they loved who were waiting for them, moments that couldn't be rescheduled or delayed without consequences that rippled far beyond airline timetables. He couldn't divert every flight for every personal crisis, but he would never again see his passengers as merely names on a manifest. They were people with stories, with loves and losses and emergencies that sometimes required more than standard operating procedures could provide. As Flight 847 continued its journey across the afternoon sky, Captain Mitchell smiled to himself and made a small course correction to take advantage of favorable winds. Every minute saved was a minute gained, and he had learned that minutes, when they matter most, are the most precious cargo any aircraft can carry. In the cabin, passengers read books, worked on laptops, dozed in their seats, and watched movies on personal devices. None of them knew about the letter their captain carried in his flight bag, or about the night when routine had been abandoned for something more important. But they were benefiting from that lesson anyway, in ways both small and large, as Captain Mitchell continued to fly with the understanding that his true job wasn't just to transport people from one airport to another, but to help them reach the places where they needed to be when the people they loved were counting on them to arrive. The aircraft continued on its path, carrying its passengers toward their destinations, while maintaining its steady course across the vast American sky, where every flight carries the possibility of ordinary miracles, and every landing represents someone's safe arrival at the place where they belong.